John Carter adjusted the straps of his uniform, his boots clicking softly against the cold marble floor. His eyes never wavered from the massive, imposing door in front of him. The door to the Forgotten Hall, located 3 levels beneath one of the most influential government buildings in the United States. The hallway was eerily silent, the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead the only sound that accompanied his steady breathing. The Forgotten Hall was a place shrouded in secrecy, its existence known only to a handful of high-ranking officials. To the world above, it was nothing more than a rumor, a whisper in the wind. Only a select few knew the truth, that it lay beneath their feet, a cryptic and ancient space whose contents were better left unknown. John had stood guard here for over 6 years, and in all that time he had never once questioned the rules. He didn't need to. No one had ever seen inside, and no one would. Those who had tried to break the rules, tried to look inside, tried to enter, had either vanished or faced consequences far worse than anyone could imagine. The rules were clear, etched into his mind after the first day on duty. No one enters the Forgotten Hall. No one looks inside. And most importantly, no one talks about what happens within. John's job was simple: guard the door. It wasn't a glamorous post, no fame, no glory, but it was a job that required unwavering commitment. As the sole guard assigned to this ancient chamber, he was the last line of defense, ensuring that the mystery of what lay beyond the door would remain sealed. As the clock ticked on, John couldn't help but notice the silence around him. The building above was alive with activity, conversations, phone calls, hurried footsteps in the hallways. But down here, deep beneath the surface, it was always quiet. The deeper you went into the heart of this building, the more you realized how alone you really were. And that suited John just fine. He'd never been one to crave attention or the spotlight. His job was simple: don't let anyone through that door. Don't let anyone see what he had only been told existed, but never allowed to witness. His hands tightened around the ceremonial halberd that rested against the wall. It was a symbol of authority, more for show than for function, but the weight of it brought comfort. The steel gleamed under the harsh light, reflecting the only source of illumination in this deadened place. His grip adjusted as he scanned the long, narrow corridor. The door before him was made of blackened oak, weathered by time but still standing strong. There were no windows, no openings, only the deep, unyielding surface that hid whatever terrible secret the hall kept. As he stared at it, John felt a faint tremor in his chest, but he swallowed it down, forcing his mind back into the rhythm of the task. He wasn't allowed to think about it. Not here. Not now. The Forgotten Hall wasn't just a place. It was an enigma, an idea that seemed to swirl just beyond the reach of his understanding. But that was how it was meant to be. John had been trained, like every other guard before him, to simply guard and to obey. John's life had revolved around this job for 6 years. It was his routine, his world, and he had come to accept that his life, in many ways, had become defined by his position as the sole protector of this forsaken place. It wasn't like other security jobs he'd held in the past. There were no visitors here, no civilians, no tourists, just the occasional government official passing through, their faces hidden behind the veil of bureaucracy. Every day was the same: stand guard, watch the door, never let anyone enter. He had seen things in the shadows, whispers that echoed from the walls, the fleeting flicker of shapes moving just beyond the corner of his eye, but he never questioned them. To question was to fail. Curiosity was dangerous in the Forgotten Hall. There were whispers about what happened to those who strayed from their duties, those who gave in to temptation. John had heard the stories, the guards before him, the ones who had failed to follow the rules, who thought they could sneak a glance inside. Some had disappeared entirely. Others had returned, but only to be reassigned to jobs where they could do no more harm. No one ever asked about the former guards. They were simply forgotten, their names erased from records, their faces vanishing from the walls of the building they once worked in. There had been one guard who had been executed for his curiosity. The whispers told him that this man had tried to pry open the door, thinking it was just a decoration, a myth. He had been found hours later, standing in front of the hall, staring at it with an expression of terror. They say he was screaming something about a great darkness. He never spoke again after that, not until they took him away and ended it all with a single shot to the head. No ceremony, no fanfare, just the quiet finality of a rule being enforced. That was the price for curiosity. That was the price for questioning the rules. John had learned the importance of silence and obedience early on. Sergeant Miller, his predecessor, had made it clear. You stay in front of that door, Carter. You don't ask questions. You don't look. And for the love of God, you don't let anyone in. Miller's words echoed in John's mind as he stood at his post, feeling the weight of the past pressing against his chest. Over the years, John had seen it all: strange noises at night, flickers of movement that seemed impossible, shadows that did not belong. Yet he had never once broken the rules. He was the guardian of the forgotten hall, and this was what he had signed up for: the sacrifice of normality for the sake of protecting something that no one should ever know. As the hours wore on, the thought of the hall, the strange forces trapped within its walls, began to nag at John's mind. What exactly was inside? But he stopped himself before the question could fully form. The rules were there for a reason. Curiosity would kill him just like it had killed the others. The answers, if there were any, would remain buried behind that door, locked away for eternity. Suddenly, a soft sound broke through the silence, a faint creak of the floor above. John's head snapped up, his heart skipping a beat. It was nothing, probably just the old building settling. Still, his body tensed, ready for any eventuality. But as the seconds ticked by, the sounds faded, leaving the air as still as ever. He glanced at his watch. It was time, shift change. John had been on guard for 16 hours straight. His legs ached, his mind was beginning to drift, but he couldn't afford to let his attention slip for even a second. Movement draws attention. Attention leads to questions. Questions lead to broken rules. He took a deep breath, pushing any fatigue aside, and resumed his silent vigil. This was his life now, his duty, his only purpose. Guard the door. Watch. Never speak of what was inside. And most importantly, never break the rules. The clock ticked slowly, each second passing with an unrelenting rhythm that echoed through the empty corridors of the government building. John Carter stood rigid in his place, his eyes never straying from the heavy oak door in front of him, the entrance to the forgotten hall. The low hum of the building's ventilation system was the only sound that punctuated the silence, but something felt different this morning. A new energy was stirring in the air, something John hadn't felt in years. The heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor, breaking the stillness. John's sharp gaze shifted towards the end of the hallway as Senator Evelyn Harris appeared, her presence commanding the space with an unmistakable authority. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, her face tense but focused as she approached him. "Sergeant Carter," she greeted, her tone both professional and assertive. I need to speak with you." John didn't respond, merely offering a silent nod, waiting for her to continue. She wasted no time. "I'm here on official government business. I need access to the Forgotten Hall. There are documents and artifacts inside that could change the course of an investigation I'm leading. This is a matter of national security." John's pulse quickened, but he didn't move. His training kicked in: guard the door, never let anyone in. His grip tightened around the halberd, feeling the comforting weight of the weapon in his hands. This was his job, and nothing, not even the senator, could sway him from it. With an air of impatience, Harris stepped forward. "Sergeant Carter, I'm a United States Senator. I hold the authority to access classified government spaces. I demand entry." Her voice rose, but her eyes never left his. John remained unmoved, his posture unyielding. "I'm sorry, Senator. I cannot let you in," he replied in a low, steady voice, maintaining eye contact. The rules were clear. They were not negotiable. Harris narrowed her eyes, stepping even closer to the door. "You don't understand the weight of what I'm asking. There are pieces inside that could expose criminal activity, corruption at the highest levels. You have no idea what's at stake." John shifted slightly, his voice unchanged. "No one enters the Forgotten Hall. It's against the rules." She exhaled sharply, frustration bubbling to the surface. "You really think you're the only one who knows about the hall? You're not. I've been briefed on its contents. What's locked behind this door is the key to everything." She stepped forward again, just inches away, her eyes searching his face for any sign of weakness. "You're not going to stop me, Carter. Do you really want to be the man who stands in the way of uncovering the truth? The man who stops history from being revealed?" John's breath caught for just a moment. There it was, the temptation, the challenge to his duty, but he didn't waver. "I'm sorry, Senator, but my orders are clear. No one gets in. Not you, not anyone." His voice was firm, resolute. The tension in the air was palpable as the silence stretched between them. Harris's face flushed with anger, but she didn't retreat. For a moment she seemed to be sizing him up, considering whether to push further or to walk away. She clearly had more power than anyone in this building, but this was one battle she could not win. Not today. Finally, her shoulders slumped, a sharp breath escaping her. "You'll regret this, Carter," she muttered, her voice colder than before. "You have no idea what's really at stake." With one last defiant glance, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the stone floor. John remained in his spot, the door still standing tall before him, its dark oak surface as impenetrable as ever. He stood there, watching her retreat, his heart pounding louder than the footsteps she left behind. For a brief moment, he considered what she had said. What if there was something in that room that could change everything? What if the truth really was behind that door? John watched the senator disappear around the corner, the hum of the building's air conditioning filling the silence. But his thoughts were elsewhere, his mind racing with a question that had no answer. What is really behind that door? The tension from the confrontation lingered in the air like smoke. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to break the rules, to demand access to the Forgotten Hall. He had been warned about the temptation of curiosity, how it could drive a man to madness. But today felt different. There was something about Harris, the way she spoke, the way she had pressed him, that made him question everything. The urgency in her voice, the implication that something monumental was locked away inside that room, it gnawed at him. He shook his head, trying to clear the thoughts from his mind. He had stood in this spot for 6 years without giving in to temptation, without faltering. He couldn't afford to break now. But the more he thought about it, the more the seeds of doubt were planted. Could he really go the rest of his life without knowing the truth about what he was guarding? The whispers he'd heard over the years, the strange shadows that moved when no one was around, they were all part of it. John had learned the hard way that once you started asking questions, there was no turning back. What is behind that door? He thought again, the question echoing in his mind like a drumbeat. The more he tried to block it out, the louder it became. And then in a flash, a memory hit him. It was something Sergeant Miller had told him when he first started this job, when the weight of the rules and the pressure of his duty were still fresh. The Forgotten Hall isn't just a room, Carter. It's a test of your will. The moment you start questioning it, you've already lost. John's fingers tightened around the halberd again, as if the weight of the weapon could stop the thoughts swirling in his head. The truth was, he was already questioning it, and that was dangerous, very dangerous. As the minutes dragged by, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The hall had always been silent, an enigma sealed away for centuries. And yet, every passing day, he felt the pressure growing. The whispers were getting louder. The shadows seemed to move just a little bit faster. John had heard rumors of the previous guards who had cracked under the pressure. One had gone mad, refusing to leave the door for days on end, convinced that the hall was alive, that it wanted him to open it. Another guard had tried to break the rules and was found on his knees, mumbling incomprehensibly about the voices inside. And then there was William, his predecessor, the one who had vanished. No one had told him exactly what had happened to William, but the rumors were enough. He had looked inside, broken the most sacred rule, and paid the price. As John stood there, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on him, he realized something. His mind was already unraveling. The paranoia was setting in, and he wasn't sure if it was the job or something deeper. Was it truly dangerous inside that hall, or was it just an old room full of forgotten government documents and artifacts waiting to be unearthed? John didn't know, but one thing was certain. The moment he let his curiosity take over, he'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. He forced his mind back to the present, staring at the door before him. The rules were simple. Guard the door, never open it, never speak of it. He had followed them for 6 years. He could follow them for 6 more. But deep inside, a part of him wondered if he could really hold out. The night stretched long and still in the narrow corridor, a silence so deep it felt suffocating. John Carter stood at his post, eyes locked onto the heavy oak door of the Forgotten Hall. His fingers gripped the ceremonial halberd, its weight grounding him, reminding him of his duty. The building above was quiet now, the hum of activity replaced by an eerie stillness that pervaded the air beneath. It was just him, the hall, and the endless silence. But tonight, something was different. A faint sound pierced the stillness, a whisper. At first it was so soft, so distant, that John thought it was just the building settling. The sound of footsteps, perhaps, a voice from above. But then there it was again. A whisper, indistinct but unmistakable, drifting up from the depths of the hall. John's pulse quickened, his heart racing in the silence. The whisper seemed to tug at him as if someone, or something, was calling out, trying to get his attention. His breath hitched as his eyes darted toward the door, the black oak now feeling heavier, more imposing than ever. For a long moment the whisper faded into the background noise of the building, an odd creak, the faint hum of the air conditioning. But then just as quickly it returned, closer, more distinct, personal. "John," the voice whispered, barely audible. He froze, his body rigid, the air around him growing thick with dread. The voice had no face, no shape, just a sound in the dark, and yet it felt as though it knew him, knew his name. His stomach churned. What was it? His mind immediately flashed to the stories he had heard from his predecessor, Sergeant William, and the others who had guarded the hall before him. Stories about the voices, those who had heard them and had failed to resist. The curiosity, the relentless need to know what lay beyond the door. The stories all ended the same way. John had heard it too, the whispers, the eerie sounds that started at night. It wasn't just a trick of the mind, it was real. And yet the rules were simple. No one listens, no one opens the door. His grip tightened on the halberd and he forced his eyes back to the door. He would not listen. He couldn't afford to. But the whispers grew louder, clearer, more insistent. John. The sound was almost unbearable now. He could feel it creeping into his thoughts, pulling at him. He had been on this job for years, 6 years to be exact, and never once had he been tempted to break the rules. But tonight was different. What was it? What did it want from him? The voices continued, each one seemingly more desperate, more personal. He could feel his resolve cracking inch by inch as the voices whispered his name over and over again. The temptation to listen, to understand what was behind those whispers, began to gnaw at him. But then, just as quickly as they had started, the whispers stopped. The corridor fell into an oppressive silence, heavier than it had been before. The sounds of the building above, the faint echo of the night's activity, faded into nothing. Only the steady ticking of the clock in his mind remained, each second dragging on like a weight pressing down on his chest. John stood there, frozen. He forced himself to breathe, to focus. It was nothing. It was just a trick. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something had shifted. The room behind that door had always been an enigma, but tonight it felt alive. The whispers, the pressure in the air, it was as though the very walls were speaking to him, urging him to step closer. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He had to stay vigilant. He couldn't break now. As the minutes stretched into hours, John tried to push the events of the night out of his mind. But the whispers lingered like a distant echo in the back of his mind, reminding him of the strange and terrifying truth about the forgotten hall. The hall had been there for centuries, its purpose shrouded in mystery. Built long before the modern age, its existence was known only to a select few. No records, no public documentation, just a whispered legend among government circles. John often wondered how it had all started. Why was it built in the first place? Who had come before him? And most importantly, what was inside? He had learned bits and pieces over the years, from the few officials brave enough to speak about it. The hall had been constructed in the late 1600s, though records from that time were scarce. It had been designed for unseen purposes, purposes that no one cared to question, much less explain. The government agents who were originally tasked with guarding the hall had been carefully selected and trained, but over time, many had vanished under mysterious circumstances. The first guards to serve in the hall had disappeared without a trace. Their names were erased from the records, their files sealed, and their families told they had simply been reassigned. Some said they had gone mad, others whispered that they had been taken by whatever force was trapped inside. But no one ever spoke about it openly. To do so was a breach of protocol, a serious offense. Over the years, several government agents had tried to investigate the hall's origins, its purpose, and the nature of the things locked away inside. But every attempt had been met with failure. Curiosity led to punishment, and those who dared to ask the wrong questions were reassigned to jobs where they could do no more harm, low-profile roles that kept them out of sight, out of mind. The hall, it seemed, was not just a room, but a place of containment, a prison for something ancient and dangerous, a relic of a time long forgotten. Whatever lay behind that door had been carefully sealed away, and the agents before John had been tasked with ensuring that it remained locked up forever. John had heard rumors about the hall's construction, whispers that the original builders had never left, that they had been buried alive, sealed within the walls of the hall to keep whatever they had found there from escaping. Some said their souls had become part of the hall's dark energy, trapped forever, guarding the secret within. But the official story, the one John had been told, was much simpler. The hall was just a secure facility that needed to be protected. What it contained was irrelevant. It was the rules that mattered. Still, as John stood in the cold silence of the corridor, with the memories of the whispers still fresh in his mind, he couldn't help but wonder. What was truly behind that door? And why, after all these years, was the pressure of guarding it becoming so unbearable? He tried to push the questions away, tried to focus on his duty. But the more he thought about it, the more he felt that he was just a small cog in a much bigger machine. A machine that had been running for centuries, guarding a secret that no one, not even the most powerful officials, seemed to want to reveal. As John stood guard, the whispers began again. This time they were louder, clearer, not a trick, not a figment of his imagination. The voices were real, and they were calling to him. It had been weeks since John's encounter with the voices, since he had heard the whispers growing louder, clearer, and far more personal. He had resisted the temptation to listen, and his resolve had remained strong, but the seed of doubt had been planted deep within him. What was behind that door? He couldn't stop asking himself. It was always there, lurking in the back of his mind. Then, one day, the building was alive with more than the usual activity. As John made his rounds near the entrance to the forgotten hall, he saw Sergeant William walking toward him, his predecessor, the man who had stood guard before him. John had heard little about William's departure, other than that he had been reassigned suddenly. William had been a legend among the guards, a figure whose silence spoke volumes. Now, as he approached, there was an odd tension between them, as if the past was reaching out to John, unspoken but pressing. William was not as he remembered. There was something weary in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. The man's posture was stiff, as if he were still holding onto some distant memory of the rigid discipline he once held dear. But there was a haunted look about him now, an unease that John couldn't ignore. "Carter, right." William's voice cracked slightly as he spoke, like a man who had been through too much to pretend everything was normal. He reached out a hand, shaking John's firmly. "Sergeant William," John said, nodding politely. He had heard stories about William's tenure guarding the hall, how he had lasted longer than anyone else before being reassigned, but no one ever spoke of why. "I see they've got you on the same post," William said, his voice quiet, almost too quiet. "Same rules, same door, same madness." John said nothing, but the tension between them was palpable. William sighed, as though the weight of something unbearable was pressing down on him. He glanced around nervously before stepping closer to John. The hallway was quiet, but something about the way he looked at the door suggested a lingering unease, something deeper than just duty. "You've heard the whispers, right?" William asked in a low voice, his eyes scanning the corridor, ensuring no one else was nearby. His tone was urgent, as if he needed to impart this information quickly, before it consumed him. John's heart skipped a beat. He didn't respond at first, but the memories of those strange voices, those whispers, came flooding back. How could William know? "I know, Sergeant," John finally managed, though his voice wavered just slightly. "The voices, they've been getting worse." William nodded grimly, his face darkening. "I warned them. I warned them about the hall's toll on the mind." He paused, as though gathering the strength to continue. "After years of standing guard, you start to hear things that aren't there. You start wondering if it's real, if it's just your mind breaking." And then he trailed off, his expression haunted. John swallowed, an unsettling feeling creeping up his spine. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. William's eyes flickered to the door again before he leaned in closer, as if the very act of speaking the truth about the hall might make it real. "I cracked." His voice was low and regretful. "After years of standing guard, after hearing the voices every night, I couldn't do it anymore. I had to know. I had to see what was behind that door. I thought maybe it was all a lie, maybe it was just the mind playing tricks, so I did it. I tried to open it." John's breath caught in his chest. William's face twisted in pain as he recalled the memory. "I was found hours later, standing there, paralyzed with fear. My mind shattered. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. They said it was because I had gone mad, tried to open the door, tried to look inside." William shook his head, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. "I couldn't even remember what I saw. My mind was broken, but there was something I do remember, the last thing I heard before I collapsed." John leaned in, his heart pounding in his chest as William's voice dropped to a whisper. The voice called my name. William's eyes were wide, filled with terror and disbelief, as if he were reliving the moment all over again. It was like it knew me, knew everything about me. It spoke to me, and the next thing I knew, I was standing there, unable to move, unable to speak, waiting for them to find me. John's stomach churned. The idea of hearing his own name from the darkness beyond that door, it was a terrifying thought, one that gnawed at the edges of his mind. "They reassigned me immediately. No explanations, no questions, just a change of post." William's voice cracked as he spoke. "And after I left, I could never escape the sound of the voice. It followed me, even when I wasn't guarding the door anymore. It still calls to me, every night." John stood there, frozen, the weight of William's words pressing down on him like a heavy stone. The voice, the one that haunted William, the one that now whispered his own name, was it real? Was it something John would have to face in time? The temptation to know, to understand the truth, began to gnaw at him with an intensity he hadn't felt before. He knew the rules. No one looks inside. No one listens. He had followed them for years. But now, standing in front of a man who had lost everything to his own curiosity, John felt a stir of doubt creeping in. Could it really be that bad? Could the hall truly hold something so dangerous, something so powerful, that it could break a man like William? William's story was chilling. But John couldn't ignore the possibility that the hall held answers. What was it? What had been locked away for centuries? Was it just a room full of forgotten documents and old relics? Or was there something more, a force, an entity waiting for the right person to break the rules? The tension inside him grew as the hours passed. The voices had already started again, soft whispers coming from behind the door. Every time they rose, the question grew louder in his mind. Should I look? John's eyes flickered to the door, and for a moment he imagined what it would be like to open it. What if the voices weren't just random sounds? What if they were calling for help, like William had suggested, like they had tried to call to him? But then John remembered William's face, the terror in his eyes, the pain in his voice. The price of curiosity. Could he really afford to lose his sanity to fall like William had? John exhaled sharply, trying to clear his head. He had always been strong, resolute, but the doubts were beginning to claw at him, making him question everything he knew about the hall. What if it wasn't just paranoia? What if there was something in there that we weren't meant to know? The internal struggle intensified. Could he resist? Could he continue to guard the door, never knowing what lay beyond it, or would his curiosity eventually lead him to make the same mistake as his predecessor? The whispering voices seemed to grow louder, filling the empty space around him. John closed his eyes, trying to block them out, trying to silence the growing temptation. He had to stay strong. He had to follow the rules. But deep down, John knew that the hall's toll on him had already begun. It was well past midnight, and the quiet hum of the building seemed to deepen into a hollow, oppressive stillness. John Carter stood at his post, just as he had every night for the past 6 years, eyes fixed on the heavy oak door of the forgotten hall, his grip firm on the ceremonial halberd. The silence around him was familiar, a constant companion in the long hours of his shift. The occasional rustling from above, a distant voice or the echo of footsteps, were the only reminders that the world outside continued to turn. Down here, it felt as though time itself had slowed, stretching into an endless night. His watch was routine. Nothing ever changed. He was unbothered by the stillness, his thoughts often wandering to the whispers, those damned voices that he had come to loathe. He had learned to ignore them, to let them wash over him like rain, never allowing them to take root in his mind. But tonight was different. A sharp crackle from his radio broke the stillness, sending a jolt of adrenaline through him. The sudden noise felt out of place in the quiet of the corridor. "Sergeant Carter, do you copy?" John reached for the radio, his heartbeat quickening. It was Commander Reyes's voice, low and urgent. "Go ahead, sir. We've got a situation, Carter. Senator Harris has gone rogue." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Senator Harris. He had thought the matter with her had ended. Her demands to enter the hall had been dismissed. What was going on? "She's managed to bribe someone on the inside, someone from the maintenance staff. They're helping her break in. We have reason to believe she's already inside the building and heading for the hall." John's stomach dropped. "Inside? Sir, are you certain?" His voice was tight, disbelief creeping into his words. "I'm certain." Reyes's voice was cold, steady. "She's been gathering information. She's obsessed with the hall, Carter. We can't afford to let her get any closer. I need you to stop her, whatever it takes." John's mind raced. Harris was here. She had been relentless in her pursuit of the hall, but he never thought she would go this far. She had crossed the line, and now John had to stop her. The consequences of failure were unimaginable. Breaking the rules was a death sentence in this line of work, and Harris wasn't just any intruder. She had the power, the influence, to turn this situation into a disaster of unprecedented scale. If she got inside the hall. "Understood, sir." John replied, his voice steady despite the growing panic inside. "I'll stop her." John's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. Stop her at all costs. The orders were clear, but the implications of stopping Harris, of confronting someone with the political power and influence she had, made his heart race. If he acted too forcefully, he risked not only his career but possibly his life. The government wouldn't hesitate to dispose of anyone who threatened the secrecy of the forgotten hall. John's fingers tightened around the halberd. It was a weapon he had never used for anything other than ceremonial purposes. Now, it felt heavier than it ever had before, as if the weight of the hall itself had been placed upon him. His heart pounded in his chest. His duty was simple: prevent anyone from entering the hall, but tonight that simplicity was shattered. How far could he go? What was the right course of action when the stakes were this high? The radio crackled again, breaking his thoughts. "Sergeant Carter, you need to move quickly. The senator has likely reached the lower levels." John snapped to attention, his mind clearing. Time to act. He could feel the tension in the air, as if the very building was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. He moved quickly, heading down the darkened corridor towards the stairwell that led deeper into the building. His steps echoed in the silence, the only sound in the vast emptiness. He could almost hear the whispers again, faint in the distance. He shook his head, forcing himself to focus. There would be no room for hesitation tonight. John reached the stairwell, his body taut with anticipation. His breath came in shallow gasps, his mind consumed by the thought of what was to come. Harris was here, and she was on her way to the hall, a place where no one, not even the most powerful officials, were allowed to enter. He had always believed that the hall was safe behind its sealed door. But now, with Harris closing in on it, that belief was about to be tested in the most dangerous way possible. The hallways leading to the Forgotten Hall were desolate and quiet. Every step John took felt louder, more noticeable, as though the building itself was drawing attention to the impending confrontation. He could hear his own breathing, feel his pulse thundering in his ears. As he rounded the corner near the final staircase, John saw the flash of light at the far end of the corridor. Someone was moving, their shadow cutting across the walls. It was Harris. She had reached the door. John's pulse quickened and his grip on the halberd tightened. This was it. He didn't hesitate. He moved toward her, his voice sharp as he called out, "Stop right there, Senator." Harris froze, her back to him. She turned slowly, a smug smile spreading across her face. She wasn't surprised. She had known he would be here. "I'm afraid you can't stop me, Sergeant." Her voice was cold, confident, as though she had already won. "You have no idea what's at stake here." John's hand shot out, blocking her path to the door. "I'm under orders to prevent anyone from entering." She raised an eyebrow, her expression mocking. "Orders?" She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I don't care about your orders. What I care about is the truth, and you're standing in the way of that." John's heart pounded as she came closer, the pressure mounting with each step. He couldn't let her pass. He had to stop her, but the consequences of failure loomed large. He could feel the weight of the rules pressing down on him, the very same rules that had kept him locked in this job for years. His grip tightened on the halberd. He couldn't let her in. Harris's smile faded, replaced by a flash of frustration. "You don't know what you're protecting, do you?" She spat. "That door holds the answers to everything. All the corruption, all the lies, and you're here standing in my way like some fool." Her words stung, but John didn't flinch. "You don't understand what's behind that door. No one does, and no one is going to." The silence stretched between them, thick and charged. She looked at him, her eyes flashing with a mix of contempt and desperation. "You're just as blind as the rest of them." John swallowed hard. He had to stop her. There was no other choice. He stepped forward, his voice steady despite the tension rising within him. "You're not getting in." For a moment, Harris seemed to consider her next move. The air was thick with the weight of the confrontation, but she finally stepped back. "We'll see about that." With a last glare, she turned and retreated into the darkness, her footsteps echoing as she disappeared around the corner. John stood there, his heart still racing but his body rigid with relief. He had stopped her for now, but as he turned back to the door of the forgotten hall, a wave of unease washed over him. This wasn't over. Harris wouldn't stop, and soon neither would he. The hours dragged on in the oppressive silence of the forgotten hall. John Carter's mind, once sharp and disciplined, felt fractured as the events of the night swirled in his thoughts. He had managed to stop Senator Harris from breaching the hall, but that wasn't enough. There was something deeper, something more insidious lurking beneath the surface. John paced the narrow corridor in front of the door, his footsteps echoing louder than he would have liked in the otherwise still air. His mind raced as he tried to keep his focus. His task was simple: guard the door. But the longer he stood here, the more the whispers seemed to gnaw at him, trying to break his resolve. They started as faint murmurs, as they always did, but tonight they were different. Louder, clearer. The soft, almost imperceptible sounds, always present in the background of his consciousness, now wrapped around his mind like a vice. John tried to ignore them, but the whispers were relentless. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, their ethereal nature making them impossible to escape. John. The voice was clear this time, cutting through the heavy silence like a sharp knife. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. His eyes darted around the dark corridor. There was no one here, no one but him and the door. He swallowed hard, trying to push the voice from his mind, but it was there, impossible to ignore. John, open it. It was his own name, spoken softly, almost tenderly. But there was something else in it, something sinister, something that made his skin crawl. For a moment he could almost see the voice, a dark shadow lingering just beyond his line of sight. His pulse quickened and his grip tightened on the halberd as he tried to steady himself. The sound of his own name being called from within the hall was too much. He fought it, struggled to maintain control. He had heard the stories, the warnings from Sergeant William and others who had come before him. Curiosity had broken them, had sent them down a path that led to madness or death. And now the voice was calling to him, inviting him to make the same mistake. John stepped back, shaking his head violently as if to shake the whispers out of his mind. His heart was pounding in his chest. He had never felt so vulnerable, so unsure of himself. Was it a trap? Was the hall playing with his mind, trying to lure him in? Or was there something real inside, something that had chosen him as its next victim? The temptation to open the door was becoming unbearable. The rules, the training, everything he had been taught seemed to fade away in the face of this insidious pressure. He wasn't just guarding the door anymore. He was standing at the edge of something, something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. "John, please, let me out." This time, the voice was more desperate, more pleading. It wasn't just a whisper, it was a cry for help. His heart twisted in his chest, and for a moment he felt something deep inside him stir, a pang of compassion, of guilt. The hall had always been a place of secrets, but what if there was more to it? What if the voices weren't just some trick of the mind, but the anguished cries of those trapped inside, calling out for release? John clenched his fists. Could it be? Could they be real? The people inside the hall, were they truly trapped, suffering for eternity with no one to hear their pleas? His mind screamed at him to stay away, to resist, but the voice was so compelling, so real, it was hard to ignore. He could feel the weight of the decision bearing down on him. The rules, the unbreakable rules. But what if the rules were wrong? What if he was the only one who could free them? The fear clawed at him, but beneath it there was something else, a strange sense of curiosity. It was the same curiosity that had led others to break the rules before him. The same curiosity that had led to their downfall. But he wasn't like them. He had to resist. John shook his head again, trying to clear the fog from his mind. Stay strong. You are in control. He had been in this position before, vulnerable, unsure, but each time he had fought through it. This time would be no different. He couldn't let the hall win. But the longer he stood there, the more the whispers swirled around him like a trap closing in. His eyes flicked back to the door. The wood seemed darker now, as though it were drawing him in. The key in his pocket felt heavier than before, as though it had a life of its own, urging him to use it. The door was still locked, but for how much longer could he stand guard, knowing that everything lay just beyond that threshold? What if he never had the chance to know the truth? What if he was destined to guard this dark secret forever, never understanding what it was he was protecting? John closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to center himself. He had to stop thinking like this. He couldn't afford to lose his mind, not now. Not when the consequences of failure were so devastating. But the temptation was too strong. The hall had chosen him. It was undeniable now. It was as though he had been set on a path he couldn't turn away from. The voices weren't just calling his name, they were calling to his soul. He reached for the key in his pocket. The cold metal felt like a shackle, pulling him toward the door. Was this the moment? Would this be the point where he gave in, just like the guards before him? As his fingers closed around the key, he felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He was standing at the precipice, and he knew that whatever choice he made next would change everything. John hesitated, his fingers trembling around the key. This was the moment that would define who he was. He could feel the call of the door, the pull of the unknown. The rules, the warnings, everything he had been taught, all of it seemed so distant now. The voices were louder, closer, their cries seeping into his very being. But John didn't move. The whispers seemed to die down for a moment, and in that silence he made his decision. He pulled the key from his pocket and placed it on the ground. He would not open the door. The temptation was still there, still gnawing at him. But John walked away from the door, his mind clear for the first time in what felt like forever. The hall had tested him. It had tried to break him. But John had resisted, at least for now. As he walked away, the whispers resumed, faint and distant, but he didn't look back. It had been days since the confrontation with Senator Harris, and John Carter had pushed the events to the back of his mind, returning to his routine of guarding the door. He had resisted the temptation, and for a while it seemed like the whispers had faded too. But deep down, John knew it wasn't over. He felt a gnawing sense of unease, like an invisible force was slowly working its way into his thoughts. Then, one evening, everything changed. It started with a noise, a faint creak like the sound of old wood bending under pressure. John's heart skipped a beat as his eyes snapped to the door. He hadn't heard anything like this before. His instincts kicked in, his body tensing as he reached for the halberd. No one should be near the door. But then the sound came again, followed by a subtle but unmistakable shift. John's gaze locked onto the heavy oak door. There, in the dim light of the corridor, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The door was slightly ajar, just a crack barely visible but enough to make his stomach churn. His first instinct was to shut it, to lock it immediately and pretend nothing had changed. But his hand hesitated on the handle. Could this be happening? Could someone have breached the hall, or was it the force inside, manipulating the lock, trying to force its way out? John's mind raced as he approached the door. He knew the rules, he knew the consequences of violating them. And yet something about the crack in the door felt too significant to ignore. It beckoned him, pulling him closer. The temptation to peek inside was stronger than ever, but he fought it. He had to. He had no choice but to remain true to his duty. With a deep breath, he pushed the door shut with a force he hadn't meant to use. But as he did, his eyes widened in shock. Something was inside the hall. It wasn't just empty space. Behind the door, he caught a glimpse of a massive shape, a relic, ancient and out of place, sitting on a pedestal. The sight was brief, but it was enough to send a wave of fear through his chest. The object seemed to glow faintly, as if pulsing with a power that no mortal hand should ever touch. John staggered back, his heart racing. His pulse pounded in his ears as his breath quickened. What was it? What had he just seen? He didn't know how long he stood there, paralyzed with fear. His mind was fighting to make sense of the sight he had glimpsed, but all he could do was replay the image of the artifact, its eerie presence searing into his mind. It was old, far older than anything he had ever encountered. The glow, the subtle shimmer it gave off, felt unnatural, like something that had been buried for centuries, waiting to be uncovered. And the energy, the power it radiated, made John's skin crawl. His thoughts spiraled as the realization slowly dawned on him. That artifact, whatever it was, had been locked away for a reason, but now it was freeing itself. John took a step back from the door, his mind in chaos. His heartbeat thundered in his chest, drowning out everything else. What was this thing? Why had it been hidden for so long? His mind flashed back to the stories, the warnings that had haunted him since the first day he had been assigned to guard this place. The relentless whispers, the strange occurrences. Could it all be tied to this artifact? Could the voices be trying to warn him, or were they drawn to it like moths to a flame? He had to know. John's fingers hovered over the lock, and before he could think better of it, he unlocked the door and pushed it open once more. This time he stepped inside. There was no turning back now. The air inside the hall was thick, heavy with something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing the full sight of the artifact. It was an ancient relic, unlike anything John had ever seen. It resembled a stone tablet, adorned with strange runes and symbols that seemed to shift and twist when his gaze moved over them. The stone seemed alive, almost sentient, as if it were watching him, waiting for him to make the next move. John stepped closer, drawn by an invisible force. His heart raced as he reached out to touch it, his fingers brushing against the cool, textured surface. The moment he made contact, something changed. A surge of energy coursed through him, sharp and electric. His body went rigid as the room seemed to shift around him. The walls blurred, and for a brief second he saw flashes of something, visions of people from the past, of ancient figures in dark robes performing rituals in a hidden chamber. The scene twisted, distorted, and then vanished. John stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was still. The energy was gone, but the feeling lingered in his veins like something had been awakened inside him. What was this thing? Why was it here? What was its purpose? The voices came again, louder this time, clearer than ever. John. The whisper sounded like it was inside his head, like 1,000 voices speaking at once. His hands trembled as he pressed them to his ears, trying to block it out. The voices weren't just calling his name anymore. They were telling him something. It can control time, John. The words reverberated in his mind, and the truth hit him with the force of a freight train. The artifact wasn't just some relic. It was a powerful weapon, a tool that could manipulate time itself. John's breath caught in his throat as his mind raced. The power to manipulate time. Could it really be possible? And if it could, what had those before him done with it? How had they used it? The visions, the dark rituals, the runes, it all started to make sense. The hall had been built to contain this power, but now it was slipping through the cracks. John's mind reeled. The artifact's energy had been affecting him, clouding his judgment. He could feel it now, gnawing at the edges of his sanity, pushing him toward madness. The whispers were no longer just outside of him. They were inside, taking root, invading his thoughts. He stumbled back, his hands shaking as he fought to maintain control. The room seemed to pulse with the artifact's energy, and for the first time, John began to wonder if he would lose himself the way the others had. The hall had chosen him, just as it had chosen the others before him. The voices had called to him. The temptation to open the door had nearly broken him. Now he had seen the truth and he understood. The hall wasn't just a place of secrets. It was a place of power, and that power was far too dangerous to be left unchecked. As he turned to leave, he knew that the battle for control had only just begun. The relic had awoken and it was calling to him. But John had to make a choice, stop it, or let it consume him. And he wasn't sure if he was strong enough to resist much longer. Days had passed since John's fateful discovery of the artifact. The hall had once again fallen into a haunting silence, but the oppressive weight of his newfound knowledge lingered. The whispers no longer felt like distant echoes. They were inside him now, like a slow, creeping fog that clouded his mind. The memories of the artifact's glow and the visions of ancient rituals flashed before his eyes at odd moments, leaving him disoriented and anxious. It wasn't just the sight of the artifact that haunted him, it was the truth. What he had seen, what he had felt in the hall, was just a fraction of something far more terrifying. The hall's purpose, the secrets it held, were far darker than he could have ever imagined. The ancient relic was not simply a tool of power. It was a weapon, a force meant to be contained at all costs. John's thoughts returned to Senator Harris. The woman who had sought the truth so desperately had unknowingly uncovered a dangerous part of that truth. She had continued her investigation, digging into the dark history of the hall, piecing together long-forgotten documents dating back centuries. The documents had been sealed away for a reason, and now they were in her hands. John's heart clenched as he remembered the last conversation with Harris. After the confrontation, she had left the building, but not without taking something with her, the knowledge she had unearthed. She had found the truth, and it was a truth that John had been shielded from until now. The documents she had uncovered painted a grim picture of the hall's origins. They detailed its true purpose, and it was more terrifying than John had ever dared to consider. The hall was never meant to contain an artifact. It was meant to protect the world from a force too dangerous to be unleashed. That force, whatever it was, had been locked away for centuries by the ancient guards who had given their sanity and their lives to ensure that it remained sealed. The writing spoke of an ancient power, something that had preyed upon those who had come into contact with it, bending their minds, distorting reality, and ultimately driving them to madness. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a presence, a force that could manipulate time and minds, warping the fabric of existence itself. John felt his stomach churn as he read the words. He could almost feel the weight of the secrets pressing down on him. The guards who had come before him had all been sacrifices, each one losing their sense of self as they spent years in the presence of that unearthly force. Some had cracked like William, their minds shattered by the whispers, unable to withstand the pull of the artifact's power. And now John was no different. The weight of this knowledge was a curse. He knew too much now, more than any man should ever know. The hall's purpose wasn't to protect a relic or preserve history. It was a containment. The hall wasn't just a building. It was a prison holding something that could change everything if it were ever released. Something that could unravel time itself. John clutched his head, feeling a familiar pressure building inside him. The temptation to look inside, to truly understand what lay behind that door, had never been stronger. He had felt the pull once before, but now it was almost unbearable. The whispers had grown louder in his mind, the power of the artifact stirring something deep within him. As he reflected on the past guards who had been sacrificed, John couldn't help but think of the one man who had gone before him, William. He had been left with nothing but the broken fragments of his sanity after standing guard for decades. John now understood the full extent of the sacrifice these men had made. They had guarded the door not just to protect the world, but to suffer in silence so that no one would ever have to face the horrors that lurked inside. The deeper John thought about it, the heavier the weight became. The truth had always been buried, locked away to protect the world from a power that should never see the light of day. And now, John was trapped in that same curse. The knowledge itself was like a disease, slowly eating away at his mind. It wasn't just the voices that tormented him now. It was the truth of the hall's existence. The burden was overwhelming. He had always believed that the hall was just a government facility, a place to store historical artifacts and documents. But the truth was so much darker. It was a prison, and the world had no idea what it had been protecting. As the days passed, John found himself becoming more distant. The walls of the corridor began to feel like a cage. The voices, the whispers, they were no longer just in his mind. They seemed to surround him, like the very building was speaking to him, urging him to open the door. He could almost hear the voices of the previous guards, their whispers begging him to give in, to free them from their eternal torment. But deep down, John knew the price of that freedom. He had read the documents. He had seen the truth. The relic, the artifact inside the hall, wasn't meant to be unleashed. Not for the sake of curiosity, not for power, not for any reason. It was too dangerous, and if he were to open that door, if he were to give in, the consequences would be catastrophic. John looked at the door once more, the black oak surface seeming to glow with an eerie energy. The temptation gnawed at him. How long could he endure this burden? The weight of the knowledge was becoming unbearable. Every night the whispers grew louder, and every day his thoughts became more clouded. He was on the edge of breaking, just like the men before him. He knew he had to make a choice, but as he stared at the door, the whispers seemed to call to him once again. "Let us out." The words were soft, almost a plea, and John felt his chest tighten. He knew he had to resist, but with each passing moment, the knowledge of what lay behind that door felt more like a curse. And as he stood there, staring at the door, he realized one horrifying truth. He was no different than the men who had come before him. The hall had claimed him, just as it had claimed all of them. The weight of the truth was more than he could carry. And soon, he would have to decide whether to break the rules or continue to guard the door, knowing that the world was safe, only because it had been locked away for centuries. The air in the corridor was thick with tension as John Carter stood in front of the heavy oak door, his hand hovering above the lock. The faint hum of the building seemed to fade into the background, as if the very world around him had stilled, waiting for him to make a choice. He had reached the breaking point. For the past few days, John had felt the pull of the artifact in his mind, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. He could feel its power from behind the door, demanding to be released, calling to him like a distant memory he couldn't quite grasp. And now, after everything he had seen, after the terrible truths he had uncovered, John was faced with a decision that could change everything. The senator had returned. Senator Harris, relentless in her quest for power, had made her final move. After all the failed attempts, after all the threats, she had made contact with John once more. This time it was different. This time it wasn't a simple request for access to the hall. It was a final ultimatum. John had received a message in the dead of night, a quiet knock on his door, and a note that chilled him to the core. Harris had gathered all the documents, all the historical records she could find. The hall's truth, the artifact's power, the danger it posed were no longer unknown to her. And now she had one last request: help her free the artifact. In return, she promised him everything: control, knowledge, and power beyond his wildest dreams. The artifact could change the course of history, she said. It could give them control over time, over destiny. Imagine what they could do together. Imagine the future they could shape. But there was a catch. If he refused, the consequences would be dire. The artifact could be unleashed by someone else, someone far less capable of controlling its power, someone who might not care about the world's safety or the rules that had kept it locked away for centuries. If he refused, he risked everything. John's mind was reeling. He had spent 6 years guarding this door, 6 years following the rules, never questioning the truth of what lay inside. But now the rules seemed so fragile, so insignificant compared to the power that the senator offered him. The whispers were louder now, like a rising storm, urging him to listen, to give in. It would be so easy, they said. One decision, one act, and everything could change. He thought of the previous guards, Sergeant William and all the others who had come before him. They had all lost their sanity, their peace, their sense of self because of curiosity, because of temptation. But what if this was different? What if this time it wasn't just about curiosity, but about doing what was right? The weight of the decision was crushing. On one side there was his duty, to prevent the artifact from being unleashed, to keep the world safe from the power that lay behind the door. But on the other side there was his humanity, the desire to be free, to shape the future, to have the power that Harris was offering, to stand alongside her and use the artifact's power to change the world. It was a fateful choice, one that could tear him apart, no matter what he decided. John stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the door, the temptation pulling at him like a rope tied around his chest. What if he was wrong? What if the hall had been wrong all along? The documents Harris had uncovered spoke of a force too dangerous to be contained, but was it really too dangerous? What if the world needed this power? What if he could control it? What if he could rewrite history? The thought was intoxicating. The very idea of controlling time, of altering the course of events, was too powerful to ignore. He could fix mistakes. He could change outcomes. The weight of the responsibility, the burden of knowing what could be possible with the artifact, was overwhelming. But then a chill ran down his spine. The price of that power. What if unleashing the artifact was a mistake? What if, once it was freed, it could never be controlled? What if it was too much for anyone, even someone as capable as John, to hold? The whispers, once so distant, now felt like a tangible force inside his mind, urging him toward the door, urging him to open it, to release the power that had been locked away for centuries. John's eyes flicked to the key in his pocket. the key that had been given to him for a reason he hadn't fully understood until now. It wasn't just a lock, it was a choice. The key to the future. The choice to either keep the artifact locked away or to embrace its power and change everything. But then, as John's hand hovered over the key, a flash of reality hit him. What would happen if he refused? The door, once firmly locked, would be opened anyway. But not by him. Not by someone who understood the power it held. Someone would unleash it, and the world would have no idea what it had just allowed to escape. Harris had already hinted at it, her knowledge, her ambition. She had bribed someone inside, someone who could break the rules. If John didn't act now, there was no telling who would. The artifact might fall into the wrong hands, and once it was unleashed, it would be too late. John's thoughts turned dark as he imagined the chaos the artifact could cause. Time could be twisted, realities could be changed, and if the wrong person got their hands on it, it could spell disaster. The world wasn't ready for this kind of power. And yet the pull of the artifact, the call of the unknown, was stronger than ever. What if he could wield it? What if he could make it his own? The choice seemed to grow heavier by the second. He could see the world he wanted, a future he controlled. But at what cost? At what price? John's hand trembled as it hovered over the key. The weight of the world felt like it was resting on his shoulders. The future, the world's future, hung in the balance. His next move would determine not only his fate, but the fate of everyone around him. For a long moment, John stared at the door, the whispers still tugging at his mind. But then, with a deep breath, he made his decision. He pulled the key from his pocket. But instead of unlocking the door, he stepped away from it. He couldn't do it. John knew that no matter how tempting the artifact's power seemed, no matter how strong the whispers were, he could not release it. Not without unleashing chaos, not without risking everything he had worked to protect. The door remained shut. John took a step back, his heart pounding, his mind still reeling from the decision he had made. But deep down, he knew it was the right one. The rules had kept the world safe for centuries. He couldn't be the one to break them, but he knew with a sickening certainty that the temptation would never go away. The whispers would continue, calling him back to the door, and one day he might not be able to resist. But for now, he had made his choice. The line had been crossed. The moment John's fingers brushed the edge of the key, something shifted. A subtle tremor, barely perceptible at first, ran through the air, an electric tension that settled deep in his bones. He had kept the door shut for so long, resisted every temptation to open it. But now, standing here with the weight of his decision still fresh in his mind, the door felt heavier than ever. He had never been this close. His hand lingered on the key in his pocket, his thoughts racing as the whispers from within the hall grew louder. They had been quiet for days, but now they were starting again, like a distant murmur growing louder, building in intensity. John's breath quickened as the whispers took shape, his pulse pounding in his ears. The air around him grew thick, oppressive, and cold. A part of him wanted to pull away, to turn around and walk away, but the other part, the part that had kept him here, guarding this door for years, wanted to understand, wanted to know what it was all for. He couldn't help it. His hand, almost of its own accord, reached for the lock. The moment the key turned, the door creaked open with a sound that echoed in the silence of the corridor. It wasn't loud, but it felt like the sound of the world shifting. The power inside the hall was awakening. At first, there was only the faintest hum, just a vibration, a low buzz in the back of his mind, like the quietest whisper. But then it grew. The whispers turned into voices, distinct and clear, filling every corner of his consciousness. John. The voice was soft, but it carried a weight to it, a power that made his skin crawl. He froze, his heart skipping a beat. The voice was like a call from the depths of the earth, ancient and timeless. "You have opened the door." The words were not a question, but a statement. The voice was deep, resonating through the walls, through his very bones. It felt like the hall itself was alive, like it was watching him, speaking directly to him. John's body trembled as the door creaked open wider, revealing what lay beyond it. He couldn't see much, just shadows, shapes that moved too quickly for him to catch. But the air inside the hall felt different. It felt thick, alive, charged with energy. The power he had been warned about for so long was not just a myth. It was real, and it was waking up. The voices grew louder, becoming a chorus of whispers, all of them speaking at once, but somehow all aimed at him. "You have freed us. Join us. Take the power. It is yours." John stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest as his mind began to reel. The voices were no longer distant, they were inside his head. They were his thoughts, their words wrapping around his mind like chains. The curse was awakening, just as the ancient documents had described. The voices were not just warnings, they were part of something much larger, something older. John could feel the hall's influence now more than ever. It wasn't just a place. It was a living, breathing entity. The whispers had always been there, but now they were real, powerful, tangible. And the more he heard them, the more his resistance began to crumble. As the whispers became louder, John's head began to pound. His mind, once clear, was now clouded by the pressing force of the voices. He fought it. He fought with everything he had, but there was something about the power of the hall, something ancient and compelling, that made it impossible to ignore. The voices were relentless. They pulled at him from all sides, urging him to step inside, to embrace the power that was now his for the taking. "You are the key. You have unlocked us. You belong to us." John's hand gripped the doorframe, and for a moment he thought he might collapse under the weight of it all. The energy, the threatening force behind the whispers was so overwhelming he could barely keep his footing. His thoughts were becoming blurred, the line between reality and the voices dissolving. He tried to steady himself, but the more he tried to block them out, the more they filled his mind. The walls of the hall seemed to shift, the air growing thick with an oppressive energy that weighed on him like a physical force. It was suffocating. The curse was spreading, filling every part of his mind, every corner of his soul. "You can't resist. You never could." The voices were becoming more familiar now, their presence so strong that it felt like they were inside his body. He couldn't escape them, couldn't shut them out. The hall was in his blood, in his thoughts, changing him. The temptation to give in, to unlock the full power of the artifact, was becoming unbearable. Embrace it. You know you want to. John's knees buckled as the hall's energy pressed on him, forcing him to his knees. His mind was screaming for him to fight, but his body felt like it was being dragged deeper, deeper into the hall's grasp. He had always been in control. He had always been able to fight the whispers, the urges. But now it felt like the hall was controlling him. The power, the curse, it wasn't just around him anymore. It was inside him, twisting his thoughts, turning his resolve to dust. "You are one of us now." The words echoed in his mind as the darkness of the hall seemed to close in around him. The whispers were no longer voices. They were feelings, emotions that surged through him, pushing him closer to madness. John fought with everything he had left. He had to resist, but the power was too strong. He had crossed the line. There was no going back. John's mind swirled with chaos. The hall's power had fully enveloped him now. The whispers, the dark energy, they were part of him, part of his soul. It had been awakened, and there was nothing left to do but embrace it or let it consume him entirely. His body trembled, his thoughts fractured, but deep down, one thought still rang clear. He couldn't let it win, not like the others, not like the guards before him who had fallen into madness. With everything he had left, he made a final, desperate choice. He couldn't open the door, but in his heart he knew. The whispers would never stop. The hall's power would always call to him. And someday, just as they had predicted, he might not be able to resist. The power within the hall had already begun to change him. As he backed away, the whispers followed him, their voices growing softer but still, somehow, louder than ever. John stood before the door again, his fingers twitching with a mix of dread and anticipation. It was no longer a matter of resisting the whispers. They had already infiltrated his mind, settled deep within his thoughts, making it impossible to think clearly. The power of the hall, the artifact, its energy, had awakened something inside him. A part of him had always known this day would come, the day when the rules would be broken. The same rules that had kept him safe, the same rules that had kept the world safe. But now they no longer seemed so clear. The artifact had shown him what was possible, what could be achieved with its power. Time itself could be rewritten. Fates could be altered, destinies reshaped. The potential of the artifact was endless, and John could no longer ignore it. He had resisted for so long. But now, as the voices inside his mind swirled and the power of the hall pressed against him, he knew he had made his choice. It was no longer about protecting the world from the artifact. It was about embracing its full potential. He had to know. With a trembling hand, John reached into his pocket and pulled out the key, the same key that had been passed down to him, the one that he had been entrusted with. The same key that had kept the door locked for centuries. The key to unlocking not just the artifact, but the power that had been held in check for so long. He couldn't keep it locked away any longer. Without a second thought, he turned the key in the lock, the familiar click echoing in the corridor like a signal that everything was about to change. The door creaked open, the shadows beyond it moving like living things, as though they had been waiting for this moment for an eternity. For a moment there was silence, but then the artifact seemed to hum, like a living being stretching after a long slumber. The power inside the hall surged, responding to the unlocking, like a sleeping giant finally awakening to the world. John stepped into the room, his heart pounding, his mind racing. The air was thick with energy, alive with power. The artifact stood before him, glowing with an almost hypnotic light, its runes pulsating as if breathing. He could feel it, its influence wrapping around him, pulling him deeper into its grip. The room felt alive, its very walls shifting and expanding, as if the hall itself were reacting to the power being unleashed. The whispers, now louder than ever, filled the room, no longer distant or fleeting. They were clear, direct, and unmistakable. They were no longer just echoes. They were voices of those who had been trapped here for centuries, those who had tried to control the power before him. You have freed us. You are the key. Embrace your destiny. John's head swirled as the voices surrounded him, their presence overwhelming, pressing on his very soul. He could feel the artifact's energy coursing through him, overwhelming his senses, pushing him to the edge. The power was intoxicating, like nothing he had ever felt before. The potential to change everything was at his fingertips, but there was a price to pay. And deep down, John knew it. But it was too late to turn back now. With a deep breath, John reached out toward the artifact, his hand trembling as he touched it. The moment his fingers made contact, a surge of raw power exploded through him. The world around him seemed to twist and distort, reality itself bending to the will of the artifact. The energy coursing through him was both exhilarating and terrifying. In an instant, the hall reacted. The walls groaned, the very ground beneath his feet seemed to shake as the artifact's power began to escape. The room seemed to stretch and pulse, as if it were alive with the force of the energy John had just unleashed. The chaos erupted almost immediately. The hall, once a place of silence and containment, was now in turmoil. The power of the artifact had broken free, and it wasn't just in the room, it was spreading. The walls, once solid and unyielding, seemed to melt, their ancient stone twisting like living flesh. The ceiling cracked, sending shards of rock falling to the ground. The air was thick with energy, crackling and alive, as if the entire building were reacting to the power that had been released. John staggered back, his mind spinning as the reality around him began to distort. Time itself felt fluid, shifting in unnatural ways. He could feel the artifacts pull deep inside him, tugging at his very soul. It was no longer just a tool, it was alive, and it was demanding more power, more control, more of him. The whispers grew louder, their voices mingling with the sounds of the hall breaking apart. The chaos outside the hall was no longer just confined to the room. It was spilling out into the corridors, into the very foundation of the building. The power of the artifact was expanding, growing beyond anything John could have anticipated. "You have awakened us. You have set us free. Now you will join us." John's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him. He hadn't just unlocked the power of the artifact. He had unleashed something far darker, something that had been contained for a reason. The curse was no longer just whispers in his mind. It was reality. The hall itself seemed to react, as if it were a living entity, its structure shifting, folding in on itself. The once imposing walls now felt like they were closing in on him, the air thick with a pressure that made it hard to breathe. The power was no longer contained. It was spilling out, uncontrollable, like a force of nature. And in that moment, John realized the true cost of breaking the rules. The world around him seemed to collapse in on itself. The ground shook, the building groaning as if it were being torn apart. The whispers were louder than ever, deafening in their intensity, filling his ears, his mind, his soul. John could feel the artifact's power ripping at his sanity, pulling at him, threatening to consume him entirely. His vision blurred as the world around him twisted, distorting into shapes he couldn't recognize. Time seemed to bend and stretch, and he couldn't tell if moments were passing in seconds or years. He had done it. He had broken the rules. And now there was no turning back. The hall, the very building, was falling apart, crumbling under the weight of the power that had been unleashed. The artifact was no longer a tool of control. It was a force of destruction. The chaos spread, ripping through the fabric of reality itself. And John, standing at the center of it all, could feel the power coursing through him, consuming him, as he finally understood the true nature of the artifact he had freed. He had released something far beyond his control, something that could not be stopped. The building trembled again, the floor beneath his feet cracking as the very world around him began to collapse. But in the midst of it all, John stood still, his mind numb as he realized the full extent of what he had unleashed. The ground trembled beneath John's feet, as though the very foundation of the world was cracking. The walls of the hall, once solid and impenetrable, now shuddered violently. The air was charged with a heavy energy, thick with the weight of the power that had just been unleashed. John staggered, trying to maintain his footing, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The world around him felt as though it were dissolving, time itself bending in unnatural ways. It was as if the fabric of reality had been ripped open, and the past, present, and future were colliding in a chaotic tornado of moments, each overlapping with the other. He could hear it before he could see it, the whispers that had once been voices of temptation, now full of rage and hunger. They were no longer just calling to him, they were consuming him. The artifact's power, once contained in the dark corners of the hall, was breaking free, spiraling outward in waves of destruction. The hall, the very building, was changing. It was no longer just a place of secrets, it was becoming something else, something alive. The walls seemed to pulse and writhe, and the floor beneath John's feet began to shift, as if the hall itself were reacting to the unleashed power. John's mind raced. He had made the choice. He had broken the rules. And now the artifact's power was ripping apart everything he had worked to protect. His thoughts were fragmented, swirling like debris in a storm. He could feel the corrupting influence of the hall beginning to seep into his mind. The whispers weren't just inside his head anymore. They were becoming part of him, pulling him toward the darkness at the center of it all. John gritted his teeth, fighting back against the pull, fighting to maintain his will. He had to stop this. He had to find a way to contain it. The hall's purpose, to contain, to protect, was no longer just a task. It had been a necessity. It had to be done. But it was already too late. Time folded in on itself, and the past bled into the present. John saw flashes, visions of ancient guards, of people long dead, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes filled with desperation. They were trying to contain the artifact, to keep it locked away, but their efforts had failed. The artifact had been too powerful, too insidious. It had consumed them, just as it was now consuming him. John tried to reach for the key that had been the last line of defense, the last remnant of control, but his hands felt heavy, his body unresponsive. The power of the artifact was too much. The hall, once a place of stillness, was now a maelstrom of chaos, and John was at its center, unable to escape. The walls of the hall were now alive, writhing like serpents, pulsating with the artifact's energy. Every time John thought he understood what was happening, the reality shifted again. The voices, those whispers, became louder, their demands more insistent. Release us. You cannot fight us. We are the power, you are nothing. John felt his grip on his own mind slipping. He could feel the power of the hall pushing against him, fighting him at every turn. His resolve, his will to stop this madness, was being torn apart by the artifact's overwhelming force. It was too powerful. No matter how hard he tried, no matter how desperately he fought, he could not contain it. The artifact's influence had grown too great. He had failed. The artifact, once an object of mystery and legend, was now something far more terrifying, a living force. The hall, once a place of order and security, was now consumed by the artifact's power, its walls breathing and shifting as though the building itself were alive. The hall's purpose, to contain, was no longer being fulfilled. Instead, the hall was breaking down, its very nature corrupted by the artifact's energy. John's mind began to unravel as the power of the artifact continued to break free. The very time around him was unraveling, stretching out into strange, disconnected moments. The present seemed to slip into the past, then back into the future, over and over, like a tornado of moments. Nothing made sense. His reality felt like it was shifting and warping. The hall's power was no longer a tool. It had become an entity, a force that was alive and unstoppable. The artifact in its full form was too much for one man, for anyone to control. And now, as the artifact's influence spread, the hall was becoming its vessel. John felt himself being pulled, dragged deeper into the artifact's grip. The power coursing through the hall began to warp his very essence. His thoughts became tangled, his will fractured as he tried to focus on the reality around him. But it was gone. Everything was gone. The world had fractured, and John was left in the center of it all, the only one aware of the true scale of what had been unleashed. He fell to his knees, the whispers surrounding him, suffocating him. The hall was no longer just a place. It was a living, breathing entity, and it had claimed him. There was no escape from the power now. He had unlocked something that could never be put back, and now the artifact's influence was spreading, too strong to resist. John's mind, his very soul, began to crack under the strain. The artifact had done more than just break the hall, it had broken him. The whispers became roars, their voices louder than ever, echoing through the hall like a deafening scream. He could no longer tell if the voices were his own thoughts or the artifact's influence taking over. The walls seemed to close in on him, the air growing thick with the weight of the artifact's energy. He had made the decision to break the rules, to release the artifact, and now the hall was coming alive around him. The power he had unleashed was unstoppable. The floor cracked beneath him, and the air hummed with the energy of something far older, far more dangerous than anything John had ever imagined. The hall's purpose had failed. The containment was broken, and now there was no way to stop the force that had been set free. John looked around, his heart pounding in his chest as the hall collapsed into chaos. The artifact's power surged, growing stronger, uncontrollable. The building itself seemed to be unraveling, collapsing under the weight of the energy that had been unleashed. The collapse had begun, and there was no turning back. The hall was no longer the place it had been, a place of silence, of secrets, and of duty. It had become a maelstrom of destruction, a living entity driven by the artifact's insatiable power. The walls writhed, shifting like sentient beings, and the air pulsed with a dark energy that suffocated everything it touched. Time had bent and broken, and reality itself seemed to be unraveling, dissolving into chaotic fragments. The world around John was collapsing, piece by piece, as the artifact's power spread further than he had ever feared. But amidst the madness, John's mind remained focused. Despite the agony, despite the overwhelming temptation to give in, he knew that there was one last chance, one last opportunity to stop this, to save what was left of the world. He had already broken the rules once. Now he had to find the strength to break them again, but this time with purpose, with conviction. He was on his knees, sweat pouring down his face, the weight of the artifact's energy pressing in on him from every direction. The voices were louder now, more insistent, taunting him, mocking him for ever thinking he could control what was inside the hall. It was the final battle, a battle of wills between the power of the artifact and his resistance. John had given everything to stop this. He had spent years guarding this door, knowing that it was his duty to prevent the artifact from being unleashed. But now, with the hall collapsing around him, he knew that the rules had failed, and there was no escaping the reality of what had been done. The artifact had taken control, but John still had one last weapon, his mind, his will. If he could hold on to that even just for a moment longer, maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to regain control. His heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to stand, his body shaking from the force of the artifact's power. He glanced around at the hall, the walls twisting and pulsing, the air heavy with a presence far older than anything he could comprehend. The artifact's power was growing, and he knew he didn't have much time. He couldn't let the hall, this living prison, become a new reality. If he did, everything would be lost. John took a deep breath, focusing all his energy on the task at hand. The whispers filled his mind, each one more insistent than the last. The voices were trying to push him down, trying to break his spirit, to make him give in. But he resisted, holding onto the clarity that had gotten him this far. The hall had tried to break him before, and now it was trying again. But he had learned something in his years guarding this door. Strength wasn't just in holding the door shut. It was in holding onto himself, even when everything around him was falling apart. He clenched his fists, his mind fighting through the fog of darkness that the artifact had created. The hall was collapsing because of its power, but it could also collapse because of him if he could fight it back. You can't win. The voice of the artifact whispered, taunting him from the shadows, from the very walls of the hall. You're nothing. You can't stop me. John's body trembled, but his mind was sharp. He would not let it win. He could feel the power of the artifact within him, tempting him with promises of control, of mastery over time itself, but he knew the price. The artifact had consumed everything it touched, and it would not stop with him. If it took him, it would take the world too. I'm not you. John's voice was hoarse but steady. I am not your servant. The artifact's power surged, blasting through the hall, but John remained rooted, focusing all his will into one singular thought: control. With all his might, John reached into the core of his mind, gathering the last ounce of strength he had left, channeling it into a single, focused point. His will became a weapon, a powerful force that clashed with the artifact's dark energy. The whispers faltered for a moment, the tension in the air thickening as John fought against the power that had been trying to consume him. He could feel his own willpower pushing back against the force that had been pulling at him for so long. The hall itself seemed to breathe with the power of the artifact, but now John's defiance was pushing against it, his resolve a shield against the darkness. With every passing second, John felt the artifact's grip weaken. His mind, once clouded by temptation, now burned with clarity. The balance between them was tipping. John closed his eyes, focusing deeper, gathering every ounce of strength and will he had left, holding onto the truth of his mission. The artifact was powerful, but John was stronger. This ends now. John's voice rang through the hall, more confident now. The hall seemed to quiver at his words, the power inside it faltering. His mind, once filled with the whispers, now pushed them back, drowning out their voices with the force of his determination. He stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the artifact, no longer afraid of what it might do. It had no hold on him anymore. He reached out, his hand steady as he made the final motion to close the door once more. The quiet that followed the battle was deafening. The hall, once alive with power and chaos, now lay still, almost serene in its aftermath. The artifact had been sealed once again, but the weight of the victory was crushing. John's body was exhausted, his mind heavy with the consequences of what he had just done. He had fought against the dark energy, against the whispers, and against the very force that had threatened to consume him, but now he was left standing alone, the weight of his actions sinking in. He had contained the artifact for now, but the hall, the living entity that had been corrupted by its power, was still there. Its influence remained, hanging in the air like an oppressive force, even if the artifact itself was locked away. John's eyes darted around the hall, his gaze falling on the cracked walls, the floors that had shifted and collapsed, and the dim light that barely illuminated the once immense structure. The hall was breathing, almost as if it were waiting for something, waiting for him. He had sealed the door, but he knew that the artifact's power was far from gone. The whispers, now silenced, were only waiting to be revived. The hall was only waiting for someone to open the door again. The temptation to release it, to let it out, would always remain. But what could he do? He had already failed. He had broken the rules. He had opened the door. The power of the artifact had already seeped into him, into the very fabric of the hall, and John knew deep down that it was too dangerous to leave the hall unguarded. He had already made the choice to protect the world, to seal the artifact away. But he also realized that this protection came at a terrible cost, a cost he hadn't considered until now. John stood still for a long moment, his mind racing. Could he do it? Could he make the ultimate sacrifice? As he looked at the hall, he felt the full weight of the decision that lay before him. He knew what was required. The hall's power wasn't something that could be contained forever by a simple lock or seal. To truly keep it sealed, to ensure that no one would ever unleash the artifact again, John would have to bind himself to the hall, become its new guardian. It wasn't a temporary job. It wasn't something he could walk away from. The curse of the hall would claim him, just as it had claimed all those who had come before him. Once he made the choice, he would be bound forever to the hall and the artifact it contained. He would be the eternal guardian, ensuring that the power never escaped again, but also knowing that he would never be free. The whispers were no longer just voices in his head. They were a part of him now. His body and soul had become intertwined with the hall, the artifact, and its influence. John's mind flashed to the previous guardians. They had made this sacrifice before him. Sergeant William, who had cracked under the pressure, lost his mind and his soul, but still managed to hold the door. And before him, all the others who had taken the same oath to guard the hall, to ensure its secrets remained hidden, even at the cost of their lives, their sanity, their very existence. They had been consumed by the hall, but they had done their duty. They had protected the world from the power that lay within, and now it was his turn. He closed his eyes, his hands trembling. He could feel the hall's pull. It was as if it were calling him, summoning him to take his place. The whispers returned, now softer but unmistakable, like a distant echo of every guardian who had come before him. You are the one. You will protect us. You will keep the power locked away. John felt his heart beat in his chest, the decision pressing down on him. The world outside, the people he had once known, seemed distant now, unreachable. He couldn't go back to them. He couldn't live a normal life anymore, not after everything he had seen, everything he had experienced. John took a deep breath. He understood now the true purpose of the hall, the reason it had existed for so long, the reason it had been kept locked away. The artifact was too powerful, too dangerous to be released into the world. Only someone bound to the hall, someone who could resist its temptation, its power, could ever truly keep it contained. And that person was him. John walked to the center of the hall, the whispers growing louder in his ears, as if the hall itself were beckoning him to take his place. He could feel the artifact's power, still thrumming in the air, still pressing against him. But now there was a sense of clarity within him, a final resolve. He stepped toward the pedestal where the artifact had once rested, now empty, its energy still lingering in the air. The hall was alive, its heartbeat pulsing with the remnants of the artifact's power. It was waiting, just as John had been waiting. John knew what he had to do. With a final look at the door he had sworn to guard, the door that would now be his prison forever, John reached out. His hand hovered over the ancient markings on the floor, markings that would bind him to the hall, bind his soul to its existence. He stepped forward, placing his hand onto the markings. The moment his skin made contact, a surge of energy shot through him, searing him to the core. His body shuddered, and for a brief moment, John felt his mind slip away. But then something clicked. The power of the artifact, the hall, the whispers, all of it merged within him. He could feel it, the bond that had been created. The sacrifice was complete. He was no longer just John Carter, the man who had once guarded the hall. He was now the guardian, bound to the hall for eternity, ensuring that no one would ever again break the rules. His life, his soul, had become part of the hall's existence. He would never leave. He would never be free. The hall had claimed him just as it had claimed all those who had come before him. John stood in the center of the hall, the energy around him settling into a quiet hum. He could feel the power, the weight of the artifact's influence, but it no longer threatened him. It had become a part of him, as it had with every guardian before him. The whispers, now soft and distant, seemed to settle in his mind like old memories. He could feel the presence of the previous guardians, their spirits woven into the fabric of the hall. They were with him as he would be with all those who came after him. The hall was sealed once more, and so was he. John's final thoughts as the hall closed around him were not of regret but of acceptance. This was his fate now. His sacrifice had been made, and he would guard the artifact, ensuring that no one would ever unleash its power again. John was now a part of the hall, just as it was a part of him. And for as long as the hall existed, he would remain its eternal guardian. Years passed, or maybe it was just days. John could no longer tell. Time had lost its meaning. The world outside, the world he had once known, seemed like a distant memory, faded and unreachable. The hall, his hall now, was his reality. It was his prison and his duty, all bound together by the same unbreakable chains. John stood at the door once more, the weight of his new existence pressing down on him. The artifact's power, still contained behind the sealed door, pulsed with an almost imperceptible rhythm like a heartbeat, a constant reminder of the forces he had fought to control. The whispers, though faint, still echoed in his mind, the voices that had once tried to lure him, seduce him into breaking the rules. But now John had become the artifact's eternal guardian. He had crossed the line. There was no going back. The hall was no longer just a place. It had become a part of him, and he a part of it. His soul, his very being, was intertwined with the hall's dark purpose. He had made his sacrifice, but with it came the realization that his watch would never end. The curse of the hall had claimed him, just as it had claimed all the others who had come before him. The door remained shut, but the power of the artifact was not truly locked away. It lingered in the walls, in the air, in the space between moments. The hall had been designed to contain it, not to erase it. And John, as its new protector, would have to remain vigilant forever, standing watch against the temptation to unleash the power once more. He moved through the hall, each step heavy with the knowledge of his fate. The walls, once cold and silent, now seemed to watch him, waiting for him to falter. The artifact's energy was never far, always present, whispering its promise of power in the back of his mind. John's existence had become an endless loop, guarding the door, listening for any sign of movement behind it and fighting against the whispers that sought to corrupt him. The hall had been sealed, but it was never truly quiet. It was alive with the power of the artifact, and so was he. The artifact's influence had shaped him, reshaped him into something different, something eternal. But he didn't feel like a man anymore. He was a guard now, an eternal watchman bound to the hall and its dark purpose. John sat in the dim light of the hall, his back pressed against the stone walls. The whispers had stopped for now, but their presence lingered in his thoughts, like a persistent hum that refused to fade. He closed his eyes, but sleep no longer came easily. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the artifact's power, felt it reaching for him, clawing at his will, trying to break him. His mind was constantly at war with itself, caught between the duty he had sworn to uphold and the temptation that would always be there, lurking just beneath the surface. The hall was a place of containment, yes, but it was also a place of corruption. The longer he stayed, the more he felt himself becoming one with it, his thoughts growing darker, more twisted. At times, he could feel his soul slipping, as if the power of the hall was trying to claim him completely. But he resisted even now after all this time. He had taken the vow to never let the artifact be unleashed, to keep the power locked away. He would stay here, forever if he had to, ensuring that the artifact never left the hall. But John knew that time was a concept that meant little to him now. In his eternal watch, there was no beginning, no end. His purpose had become as timeless as the hall itself. He was the guardian, locked in this endless battle, standing between the world outside and the dangerous power behind the door. John wandered through the hall's dark corridors, his footsteps echoing through the silence. The air was thick with the power of the artifact, as though the walls themselves were alive with it. Every step he took, every breath he drew, was a reminder of the cycle that had begun long before him and would continue long after. He was now a part of the hall, just as it was a part of him. The legacy of the Guardians had passed on to him, and with it, the burden of protecting the world from the artifact's power. He would never leave this place, never know freedom again. The hall was a prison, but it was also his home. The sacrifices of those who had come before him were not forgotten. He could feel their presence, their whispers echoing through the stones, urging him to stay strong. The days, if they could even be called days, blurred into one another. There were no seasons, no rising and setting of the sun. There was only the hall and the eternal task he had taken on. Guarding the door was now as much a part of him as the whispers in his mind. John knew the world outside had continued without him. He knew that time had moved on, that people had been born, lived, and died while he remained here, locked away in the hall. He had given up everything, his life, his future, his humanity, to protect the world from the power of the artifact. But that sacrifice was the price of protection. The whispers came again, faint but persistent, reminding him of the duty he had sworn to uphold. He could never rest, never stop watching. He could never leave. The artifact was contained for now, but its power would always be there, hidden away in the depths of the hall, waiting for the next tempted soul to try and break the rules. And when that day came, when someone else would challenge the containment of the artifact, John would still be here, the eternal guard, standing between the world and the power that had threatened to destroy it. The air in the hall was still heavy with the presence of John's legacy. Even though his watch had long been established, the hall continued to pulse with the ancient power of the artifact, its influence always simmering just beneath the surface. The whispers, faint but persistent, still danced through the corridors like faint echoes of the past, reminders of the duties John had sworn to uphold. The cycle had not ended. It had only shifted to the next chapter. New guards arrived at the hall, unaware of the true nature of their duty. They were eager, wide-eyed, their uniforms crisp and their minds filled with the excitement of a fresh start. They didn't know the rules, the unspoken, sacred rules that had been passed down through the generations of men and women who had been chosen to guard this forbidden place. They didn't know what they would face, what would be asked of them, or the terrible price they would pay for breaking the rules. John's legacy had been passed on. He was no longer the sole figure standing between the world and the power contained in the artifact. The new guards would be tested just as he had been. They would hear the whispers, they would feel the pull of temptation, and they would have to make the same choice that John had made. Would they hold fast, or would they be consumed by the allure of what lay beyond the door? John's legacy was not just a history. It was a living, breathing entity, passed on from one generation of guardians to the next. And the hall, that once quiet, secretive place, had become a symbol of both protection and destruction. It was a warning, and it always would be. The hall had been sealed, yes. The artifact had been contained, but the mystery surrounding it remained. The temptation to open the door to glimpse what was inside would always linger. John had resisted it, his resolve unbroken. But the temptation had never truly gone away. It still whispered in the hearts of those who came after him, waiting for the moment when one of them would falter, when one of them would crack under the weight of their duty. As the new guards took their posts, John's watchful eyes seemed to linger over them, even though he was no longer physically present. His spirit, bound to the hall, watched with a quiet knowing. They would soon learn the price of their curiosity. Just as it had been for him, the moment of reckoning would come for them. They would begin to hear the whispers, the soft, almost imperceptible voices that spoke of things best left unknown. The voices would call out, coaxing them to open the door to release the artifact from its prison. Some might resist, others might not. The cycle was eternal. Those who gave in would become the next guardians, locked forever in the same battle between temptation and duty. As the hall fell back into its usual silence, a new guard stood before the sealed door, unaware of the dark history he had just entered. His eyes were full of innocence, filled with the excitement of his first assignment. But as his fingers brushed against the door's cold, worn surface, he felt it, a sudden weight pressing against him. The hall felt alive, waiting. The whispers began, so faint that they could easily be ignored, just a distant hum like the sound of wind against stone. But they grew louder, sharper, more distinct, as though something was trying to communicate with him. A name, a promise, a threat. John's final thoughts echoed in the mind of the new guard, though he could not have known it. Some doors should never be opened. And for a brief moment the guard hesitated. The door seemed to call to him as it had called to John, as it had called to all the others before him. The temptation was there, palpable in the air, ready to pull him in. He stood at the threshold, the weight of centuries pressing down on his shoulders. But just as the whispers grew too loud to ignore, something inside him, perhaps a memory, perhaps a sense of duty, stopped him. He stepped back. The door remained closed, but the whispering would always be there. For as long as the hall stood, the whispers would never fade. The new guard would always have the choice to follow the rules or to succumb to the lure of the unknown. And so the cycle continued.